The FBI agent's badge gleamed under my porch light as she read from a warrant that classified my backyard pool demolition as domestic terrorism targeting critical infrastructure. Standing behind her, Margaret Thornfielder, HOA president, wore the same satisfied smirk she'd flashed when she'd reported me for destabilizing the neighborhood's water management system. I stared at the federal warrant in my hands, struggling to process words like infrastructure sabotage and threat to community safety, next to a description of my demolished, kidney-shaped pool. Agent Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably. Clearly, as bewildered by this assignment as I was by receiving it. Margaret, however, radiated vindication from her position at the edge of my driveway, occasionally nodding gravely as if my concrete removal had indeed threatened national security. What Margaret Thornfield didn't realize was that I'd spent 15 years as a federal infrastructure analyst and I knew exactly which laws she'd been breaking for the past 3 years. The pool was just bait. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds insane, right? A pool demolition becoming a terrorism case? Well, I'll stick around because this story gets so much crazier. And I guarantee you've never dealt with an HOA president quite like Margaret Thornfield. If you've ever had your own run-in with power-hungry neighbors, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear how wild your stories get compared to this one. 6 months earlier, my life looked completely different. Danielle Crosswater, recently divorced father of 2, freelance cybersecurity consultant trying to rebuild after my marriage imploded. Emma, 12, and Tyler, 9, visited every other weekend per our custody agreement. The pool had been Sarah's dream when we'd bought the house 8 years ago. But after the divorce, maintaining that kidney-shaped money pit became my nightmare. The repair estimate hit like a sledgehammer: $8,000 for new filtration, liner replacement, and structural reinforcement. Meanwhile, my divorce attorney bills still arrived monthly, and Emma needed orthodontics. Demolition cost $3,000, leaving me $5,000 ahead and one less responsibility. Simple math. Sensible décision. Margaret Thornfield saw it differently. She'd ruled Willowbrook Estates with an iron fist for 8 years, transforming our planned community of 340 homes into her personal kingdom. Every blade of grass measured, every mailbox inspected, every resident monitored for compliance with her ever-expanding interpretation of neighborhood standards. The first violation notice appeared 3 days after the demolition crew finished. Unauthorized landscaping modification requiring Architectural Review Board approval. $250 fine, plus demand for restoration to original specifications. I called the HOA office expecting reasonable discussion. Margaret's voice dripped ice through the phone. Mr. Crosswater, your unilateral decision to remove a major water feature affects neighborhood drainage patterns and property aesthetics. The board requires complete documentation of environmental impact before approving such drastic alterations. Environmental impact. For removing a decorative waterhole from my own backyard, something in her tone suggested this transcended normal bureaucratic overreach. This felt personal, though I couldn't understand why. My background analyzing infrastructure vulnerabilities for the Department of Homeland Security taught me to recognize patterns, threats, and weaknesses in complex systems. Margaret Thornfield was definitely a complex system with multiple vulnerabilities. But first, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Research revealed Margaret's transformation from county clerk to neighborhood dictator began after her election as HOA president. Prévieux résidents describent la graduelle escalation. First, zealous enforcement of existing rules. Then, creative interpretation of vague regulations. Finally, invention of entirely new requirements backed by threats of liens and foreclosure. 3 families had sold and moved rather than fight her crusades. The Hendersons left after Margaret declared their vegetable garden a commercial agricultural operation, requiring special permits. The Johnsons fled when she classified their teenage son's drum practice as industrial noise pollution. The Washingtons departed after months of harassment about their non-conforming ethnic landscaping choices. Each victory emboldened Margaret further. Residents learned to keep their heads down, pay their fines, and avoid drawing her attention. The monthly HOA meetings became Margaret's personal court, where she dispensed judgment and collected tribute from her subjects. But something else caught my analytical eye while reviewing financial records available to homeowners. The HOA collected $280 monthly from each household, nearly $1 million annually. Yet our amenities remained basic: a small playground, modest clubhouse, and minimal landscaping maintenance. Where was that money going? Margaret escalated our pool dispute with military precision. Daily violation notices multiplied. Grass too long. Trash cans visible 30 minutes past collection. Holiday decorations displayed beyond approved timeframes. Each citation carried escalating fines and increasingly urgent language about pattern of non-compliance and threat to community standards. The breaking point arrived when she targeted my children. Emma and Tyler's weekend visits apparently violated noise ordinances. Their laughter during Saturday morning cartoons constituted disruption of neighborhood tranquility. Their bicycle riding represented unsafe vehicle operation on community pathways. Jennifer Hayes knocked on my door that evening, clutching a manila folder thick with documents. My neighbor across the street, a retired paralegal with silver hair and sharp eyes, had been watching Margaret's campaign against me with growing concern. "Dan, I need to show you something," she said, settling into my kitchen chair. "Margaret's not just targeting you. She's been systematically harassing residents for 3 years. And I've been documenting everything." Jennifer's folder contained photographs, recorded phone calls, copies of violation notices, and financial analysis that made my blood run cold. Margaret had weaponized HOA authority into a systematic extortion operation, targeting vulnerable residents with impossible demands and crushing fines. "She picks victims carefully," Jennifer explained, spreading evidence across my table. "Single parents, elderly residents, anyone she thinks won't fight back effectively. But you're different. Dan, you have resources, knowledge, and motivation she doesn't understand yet." The financial documents Jennifer had uncovered revealed stunning discrepancies. The HOA's annual budget showed massive payments to Thornfield Consulting Solutions, Margaret's personal company for undefined community enhancement services, nearly $50,000 over 2 years, with no visible improvements to justify those expenses. "There's more," Jennifer continued, producing bank statements and invoices. "Margaret's mother has Alzheimer's. She's in Sunset Manor, the most expensive memory care facility in the county. $4,000 monthly. Margaret's county clerk pension couldn't possibly cover those costs." The puzzle pieces aligned with frightening clarity. Margaret wasn't just power-hungry, she was desperate. Her embezzlement funded her mother's care, making her increasingly aggressive about generating HOA revenue through fines and violations. My pool demolition threatened her narrative of absolute authority, so she'd escalated to legal warfare. "Jennifer, how long have you been investigating this?" 18 months. Ever since she tried to foreclose on the Washington's house over fabricated violations. Jennifer's voice hardened. I knew she was corrupt, but proving it required patience and careful documentation. Agent Chen returned the following Tuesday with a full investigative team. Federal terrorism charges, even ridiculous ones, demanded thorough examination. Margaret accompanied them, playing the role of concerned citizen cooperating with national security investigations. Watching Margaret perform her civic duty act was educational. She guided agents through the neighborhood, pointing out my suspicious modifications and explaining how pool removal could destabilize underground water systems. Her performance was confident, detailed, and completely fabricated. But Agent Chen was sharper than Margaret realized. During our interview, she asked pointed questions about my background, my motivations, and my demolition methods. When I mentioned my 15 years with DHS analyzing infrastructure vulnerabilities, her entire demeanor shifted. "Mr. Crosswater, you were with the Department of Homeland Security? Infrastructure Security Division. I spent my career evaluating actual threats to critical systems." I let that sink in. Agent Chen, with respect, removing a residential swimming pool poses zero threat to any infrastructure system. She studied me carefully. "What's your professional assessment of the allegations?" Someone with limited understanding of infrastructure systems filed a false report, possibly to weaponize federal law enforcement for personal purposes. I kept my voice neutral. Professional. The drainage impact of pool removal is precisely zero. Any engineer would confirm that. Agent Chen nodded slowly. Mr. Crosswater, are you aware of any other issues in your neighborhood that might merit federal attention? Margaret, standing nearby, visibly tensed. She hadn't expected this conversation to pivot toward other potential crimes. Agent Chen, I'd be happy to discuss any concerns about misuse of federal resources or false reporting to federal agencies. I smiled pleasantly at Margaret. I believe strongly in accountability and proper use of government systems. That evening, Jennifer arrived with additional documentation and a proposal that would change everything. Dan, I've been thinking about our conversation. Margaret believes she can intimidate you with federal charges, but she's made a fatal mistake. She's opened the door to federal scrutiny of everything she's been doing. Jennifer's new evidence was devastating. Email threads between Margaret and Rick Sullivan, the HOA treasurer and her accomplice, discussing how to maximize revenue generation through strategic enforcement. Detailed plans for targeting specific residents based on their perceived vulnerability. Most damning, explicit discussion of fabricating violations to justify liens and foreclosures. She keeps digital records of everything. Jennifer explained, Margaret's convinced her authority protects her, so she documents her crimes in detail. These emails show conspiracy, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. But the most explosive revelation came in a recorded phone call between Margaret and Rick, discussing my case specifically. The pool demolition is perfect. Margaret's voice crackled through Jennifer's hidden recorder. It gives us precedent for requiring approval on any property modification. We can generate thousands in fees and fines from other residents. Rick's nervous response revealed the scope of their operation. Margaret, what if he fights this? He seems different from our usual targets. He's a divorced man with kids and financial pressure. He'll pay rather than risk losing his house. Margaret's confidence was absolute. Besides, if he causes trouble, we escalate. City complaints. Code enforcement. Whatever it takes to break him. The recording continued with chilling detail about their systematic harassment campaigns. Margaret and Rick had refined intimidation into an art form, using HOA authority to terrorize residents into compliance or departure. Jennifer, how did you get this recording? Margaret called an emergency board meeting at Rick's house last week. I volunteer for the Neighborhood Watch program, so I have access to security equipment. She smiled grimly. Technically, I was testing audio surveillance for the Community Safety Initiative. Jennifer's 18-month investigation had captured everything: financial fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and now false reporting to federal agencies. Margaret had built a criminal enterprise using HOA authority as her weapon, but she'd finally targeted someone with the knowledge and resources to fight back effectively. What's our next move? I asked. We let Margaret think she's winning while we build an airtight federal case. Her terrorism report opened federal jurisdiction. Now we document everything she does. Litera deepa, and prepare for total exposure. Jennifer's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret's overconfidence would become her downfall. Each escalation, each illegal action, each abuse of authority would be carefully documented and preserved for federal prosecutors. But first, we needed to survive Margaret's current offensive. The terrorism investigation continued. Media attention intensified, and Margaret's harassment campaign reached new levels of vindictive creativity. The local news picked up the story. OA, President reports pool demolition as terrorism. Channel 7's coverage painted me as either a reasonable homeowner or dangerous radical, depending on which neighbor they interviewed. Margaret gave multiple interviews, portraying herself as a vigilant community leader, protecting residents from infrastructure sabotage. Social media exploded. Pool terrorism became a local meme. My story spread across neighborhood Facebook groups, HOA reform websites, and legal forums. Thousands of comments shared similar experiences with abusive HOA leadership. I'd accidentally become a symbol of resistance against suburban authoritarianism. Margaret interpreted media attention as validation. She scheduled another emergency board meeting to address ongoing security threats in our neighborhood. This time, Jennifer and I were ready. Rick Sullivan, the HOA treasurer and Margaret's financial co-conspirator, was beginning to show cracks under pressure. A certified public accountant by training, he understood the legal implications of their activities better than Margaret. Her escalation to federal charges had crossed lines he never intended to cross. During the emergency meeting, Rick's nervous energy was palpable. He fidgeted with papers, avoided eye contact, and twice attempted to moderate Margaret's increasingly extreme proposals. When she suggested hiring private security to monitor problem residents, Rick finally spoke up. "Margaret, don't you think we're overreacting? It was just a pool demolition." Margaret's response revealed the depth of her delusion. "Rick, this is about principle. If we allow one resident to ignore HOA authority, others will follow. Soon we'll have chaos. Property values will collapse, and everything we've built will be destroyed." Jennifer, attending as a concerned resident, recorded every word. Margaret's public statements about principle and authority would become evidence of her systematic abuse of power when federal prosecutors eventually reviewed our case. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her next escalation would push our conflict into territory none of us anticipated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would expose the full scope of her criminal enterprise and transform our neighborhood forever. The Emergency Powers Resolution passed the HOA board by a vote of 3-2, granting Margaret unprecedented authority to address ongoing security threats. Those powers included hiring private security, installing surveillance equipment, and implementing enhanced enforcement protocols for resident compliance. Within days, Willowbrook Estates resembled a police state. Security guards patrolled our streets. Cameras appeared on corner streetlights, and residents received detailed questionnaires about their awareness of suspicious activities. Margaret had transformed a pool demolition into justification for total surveillance of our community. But her most dangerous mistake was yet to come, and it would trigger a federal investigation that would expose everything she'd been hiding for 3 years. Margaret's most dangerous mistake arrived in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. An official HOA violation citing my children for unauthorized recreational activities during designated quiet hours. The violation specifically targeted Emma and Tyler's weekend visits, classifying their presence as disruptive temporary occupancy, requiring special permits and additional fees. That single document changed everything. Margaret had crossed from property disputes into family warfare, giving me the moral authority to destroy her completely. Jennifer knocked on my door within hours, her face pale with urgency. "Dan, she's lost her mind. She just issued violations to 6 other families with children. Margaret's targeting kids now." The pattern was unmistakable. The Nakamura twins faced citations for excessive bicycle operation. The Rodriguez family received violations for their toddler's non-compliant playground usage. Even elderly Mrs. Patterson got cited because her visiting grandchildren exceeded approved occupancy limits. Margaret had weaponized HOA authority against children to generate revenue and assert dominance. Every parental instinct screamed for immediate retaliation. But my federal training demanded strategic patience. Margaret was exposing herself to criminal charges far more serious than embezzlement. "Jennifer, are you still recording everything? Every word, every meeting, every violation notice." She pulled out her phone, showing dozens of audio files. Margaret called another emergency session for tonight. She's planning something big. Agent Chen returned that afternoon with a federal prosecutor and 2 additional investigators. The terrorism charges had been officially dropped, but new concerns had emerged about civil rights violations and systematic harassment of residents. "Mr. Crosswater," Agent Chen began, "we've completed our infrastructure assessment. Your pool removal posed 0 threat to any system. However, we've discovered evidence suggesting false reporting and possible conspiracy to misuse federal resources." The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Martinez, took over. "We're particularly interested in patterns of harassment targeting protected classes, including families with children. Do you have documentation of systematic discrimination?" I handed her Jennifer's comprehensive evidence package, recordings, financial documents, violation patterns, and the smoking gun Margaret's written policy targeting problem families for enhanced enforcement. Prosecutor Martinez studied the documents with growing amazement. "This is a civil rights lawsuit waiting to happen. Selective enforcement based on family status, financial vulnerability, and perceived inability to fight back." She looked up at me. "Mr. Crosswater, would you be willing to coordinate with our investigation?" "Absolutely. But I want to understand something first. Margaret filed terrorism charges against me, knowing they were false. What are the consequences for that? Agent Chen's smile was grim. Filing false reports to federal agencies carries up to 5 years in federal prison. Conspiracy to misuse federal resources adds another 5 years. If we can prove she targeted you specifically to silence opposition to her other crimes, we're looking at civil rights violations under color of law. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was Margaret's coronation as neighborhood dictator. Security guards flanked the clubhouse entrance, checking identification and restricting attendance to approved residents only. Cameras recorded everyone entering and leaving. Margaret had transformed our community meeting into a surveillance operation. Inside, Margaret announced her Willowbrook Safety Initiative, a comprehensive program requiring background checks for all visitors, mandatory reporting of suspicious activities, and enhanced penalties for non-compliant residents. The program specifically targeted families with children, elderly residents, and anyone who had previously questioned HOA policies. Jennifer attended as an approved resident, recording Margaret's speech with crystal clarity. But the most damning evidence came from Rick Sullivan's visible discomfort as Margaret outlined their expansion plans. Phase 2 involves acquiring additional properties through strategic foreclosure. Margaret announced to the board, non-compliant residents will face escalating fines until they choose to sell or lose their homes to HOA liens. Rick's face went white. He tried to interrupt, but Margaret steamrolled ahead, detailing their systematic plan to force out undesirable residents and replace them with community-minded homeowners who would support expanded HOA authority. Margaret, Rick finally managed. This sounds like we're targeting specific families for removal. We're protecting property values and community standards. Margaret replied coldly. Some residents simply don't belong in Willowbrook Estates. That statement, recorded in high-definition audio, would later become Exhibit A in the federal civil rights prosecution. After the meeting, Rick approached Jennifer in the parking lot, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his car keys. Mrs. Hayes, can I speak with you privately? Jennifer followed him to his sedan, keeping her recording device active. Rick's breakdown was complete and immediate. She's gone completely insane, he whispered, looking around frantically. The terrorism report was bad enough, but now she wants to target families with children. I'm a CPA, not a criminal. I can't be part of this anymore. Rick's confession poured out. 3 years of financial manipulation, falsified records, strategic harassment campaigns, and systematic abuse of HOA authority. Margaret had convinced him they were protecting community standards, but her escalation to federal charges and family targeting had shattered his rationalization. She's embezzled $47,000 to pay for her mother's memory care. Rick revealed, the Thornfield consulting contracts are completely fabricated. All that money went to Sunset Manor. Jennifer's recorder captured every detail, bank account numbers, contract de date, specific amounts, and Rick's admission of conspiracy. But the most explosive revelation concerned Margaret's future plans. She wants to foreclose on at least 12 properties in the next year. Rick continued, families with children, elderly residents on fixed incomes, anyone she considers problematic. The goal is replacing them with residents who won't question her authority. Jennifer immediately contacted me with Rick's confession. By morning, federal agents were interviewing him under immunity protection, and prosecutors were building comprehensive cases for embezzlement, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her final gambit would expose the full extent of her delusion and criminality. The next morning brought another shock. Margaret had filed additional complaints with the FBI, claiming I was orchestrating a domestic terrorism cell targeting HOA leadership. According to her report, my coordination with Jennifer and other residents constituted conspiracy to overthrow legitimate community governance through intimidation and violence. Agent Chen called me directly. Mr. Crosswater, we need to discuss these new allegations immediately. At FBI headquarters, I found myself facing 3 agents, 2 prosecutors, and a domestic terrorism specialist. Margaret's latest report was extensive, detailed, and completely fabricated. She claimed to have evidence of weapons stockpiling, coordination with anti-government extremists, and plans for violent attacks on HOA facilities. Agent Chen, you've investigated my background thoroughly. Do these allegations seem credible to you? Frankly, no, but we're required to investigate all domestic terrorism reports. Regardless of source credibility, she leaned forward. However, this pattern of false reporting is becoming a federal crime in itself. Prosecutor Martinez was more direct. Mr. Crosswater, Margaret Thornfield has now filed multiple false reports with federal agencies. Each report appears designed to silence your opposition to her activities. This constitutes criminal harassment using federal resources as weapons. The domestic terrorism specialist, Agent Williams, had reviewed Margaret's psychological profile with growing concern. In my experience, individuals who repeatedly file false terrorism reports are often projecting their own criminal behavior onto others. Her escalation pattern suggests desperation and possible mental instability. That afternoon, federal agents executed search warrants on Margaret's home, HOA offices, and Rick Sullivan's accounting firm. The evidence they discovered exceeded even Jennifer's comprehensive investigation. Margaret's home office contained detailed files on every resident, including personal information obtained through illegal means, credit reports, employment records, medical information, and family details. She'd created comprehensive dossiers for enforcement targeting, identifying each family's vulnerabilities for maximum harassment effectiveness. The HOA offices revealed sophisticated financial fraud, fake invoices, manipulated accounting records, and systematic embezzlement totaling $63,000 over 3 years. Margaret had stolen enough money to buy herself a luxury car while residents struggled with her escalating fines and assessments. But the most disturbing discovery was Margaret's master plan, a detailed strategy document outlining her vision for Willowbrook Estates' future. Phase 1 had been establishing control through intimidation. Phase 2 involved selective foreclosures to remove undesirable residents. Phase 3 planned expanding her model to other HOA communities as a consulting service. Margaret Thornfield had envisioned herself as the architect of suburban authoritarianism, franchising her harassment techniques to HOA leaders nationwide. Rick Sullivan's cooperation provided the final pieces. He documented every financial transaction, recorded phone conversations, and maintained copies of all fraudulent documents. His evidence would ensure Margaret faced maximum penalties for her comprehensive criminal enterprise. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Residents who'd suffered silently for years came forward with their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and financial abuse. 23 families filed formal complaints with federal authorities, creating a class-action civil rights lawsuit that would reshape HOA law nationwide. Emma and Tyler, my kids, attended the first post-Margaret HOA meeting as special guests. The new board, led by Jennifer as interim president, unanimously voted to install a community pullerger and more beautiful than the one I'd demolished. They asked me to chair the construction oversight committee, ensuring everything was built to proper specifications. Margaret's trial lasted 3 weeks. Federal prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of embezzlement, civil rights violations, conspiracy, false reporting, and systematic abuse of authority. Her defense attorney struggled to explain away recorded confessions, financial documents, and testimony from dozens of victims. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Margaret to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years supervised probation and full restitution to all victims. Rick Sullivan received 6 months home confinement and community service in exchange for his cooperation. He lost his CPA license but avoided prison time by helping investigators recover stolen funds and identify other victims of Margaret's schemes. The civil lawsuit settlement totaled over $200,000, funded by Margaret's seized assets and HOA insurance. Every family she'd harassed received compensation, and new bylaws prevented future abuse of HOA authority. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates had transformed into everything Margaret claimed to protect: a thriving community with rising property values, happy families, and transparent governance. The new pool hosted neighborhood barbecues every weekend. Children played freely without fear of violations. Residents participated enthusiastically in community decisions. Jennifer won election as permanent HOA president by unanimous vote, implementing reforms that became models for communities nationwide. The Willowbrook standards required transparent budgets, due process for violations, and strict limits on HOA authority. My consulting business exploded after the case gained national attention. Communities across the country hired me to investigate their own HOA problems and implement abuse prevention measures. Congressional testimony about HOA reform led to the Willowbrook Act, federal legislation protecting residents from systematic harassment. Agent Chen earned promotion partly for her handling of our complex case. She now specializes in HOA-related federal crimes, investigating similar situations nationwide. Her advice to victims is always the same: document everything, know your rights, and never let bullies convince you they're legitimate authorities. The terrorism charges that started everything became legal precedent for prosecuting false reporting as domestic terrorism itself. Margaret's case is now cited in law enforcement training about misuse of federal resources and systematic harassment campaigns. Emma and Tyler learned valuable lessons about standing up to injustice and the importance of community solidarity. They're proud their father helped transform our neighborhood from a place of fear into a model of democratic governance. Last month, I received a letter from Sunset Manor informing me that Margaret's mother had passed away peacefully. The facility director mentioned that all care costs had been properly covered through legitimate means, ensuring the family faced no additional financial burden. Margaret served her full sentence without incident. Upon release, she moved to another state, far from any HOA communities. According to public records, she now works as a night security guard, a position with clear authority limits and extensive oversight. The pool that started this whole adventure was completed last spring. It's beautiful, functional, and properly permitted with full HOA approval. Emma and Tyler love hosting their friends for swimming parties, and every splash reminds me that sometimes the best revenge is building something better than what you lost. If you're dealing with an abusive HOA or know someone who is, don't stay silent. Document everything. Know your rights. And remember, sometimes the person trying to intimidate you has the most to hide. Drop a comment about your HOA experiences. And let's build a community of people who won't let bullies win. The ripple effects continue expanding beyond our neighborhood. 3 other HOA presidents in neighboring communities resigned after residents demanded audits inspired by our case. Local news stations created investigative series exposing similar corruption, leading to criminal charges against 2 additional HOA boards. Real estate agents now specifically market homes in Willowbrook estates as examples of reformed HOA governance. Property values increased 15% since Margaret's removal, proving that legitimate community leadership actually enhances investment value rather than protecting it through intimidation. My children's friends from other neighborhoods often ask why their HOAs can't be more like ours. Emma has started a youth advocacy group teaching kids about community involvement and standing up to bullying. Tyler designed a presentation about fair governance that he shared with 5 different schools. The educational foundation we established using settlement funds now provides legal assistance to families facing HOA abuse nationwide. Jennifer and I serve on the board, reviewing cases and connecting victims with resources. We've helped over 100 families in the past year alone. Most rewarding was last month's letter from a single mother in Ohio whose HOA president backed down immediately after she mentioned our case and threatened federal investigation. Sometimes the mere possibility of accountability stops abuse before it escalates. The ultimate irony? Margaret's terrorism charges taught me that the real terrorists in suburban America are often the people claiming to protect us from imaginary threats while systematically destroying the communities they're supposed to serve. Oh, and Margaret, if you're watching this from wherever you ended up, your appeals were all denied. The new pool is gorgeous. And yes, we did find the rest of the money you tried to hide. The community you tried to control is thriving without you. And that's the sweetest justice of all.